It's great to be here, especially on Sustainability Day. I was reading the news yesterday and I was excited to see even the CIA is getting into it. They actually issued a press release saying that all the documents they shred, they use to generate heat for the CIA building. It's fun to see how many people get into days like this. It's great to have people here interested in sustainability, but what I'm going to talk about is the hard part of sustainability, and there's probably a dozen things I want to cover with you as I talk about that. You know, talk about sustainability is usually pretty easy, and a lot of people talk about it. Getting things done is much, much harder. I heard after the concert here for the Sustainability and Arts Festival Thursday night, there wasn't really a sustainable cleanup after the event. And that's what I mean by the reality of achieving sustainability. It takes a lot more than good intentions. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of serious work to make that happen. People talk about a green revolution, a sustainability revolution. People forget, as Tom Friedman has said, that revolutions are generally pretty painful, as we see. People get hurt, people pay a big price, and we're seeing that in certain revolutions in the Mideast today. The same is true in our business, in the business of sustainability. And if in fact we are going to achieve sustainability, the people who have a stake in it, a stake against having it happen, will in fact fight pretty hard. And they're generally the people with a lot more resources than people who are trying to push sustainability, because they're small startup efforts, whether they're social movements or small startups or small new technologies. They're fighting the incumbents. So the way I look at it is I don't quite think of myself as an environmentalist. I often complain about certain things that environmentalists do. What we need to be to bridge the gap between the best of intentions and the reality of making things happen is be pragmatalists. So I say I'm a pragmatalist, not an environmentalist. And I'll talk about some of the differences between those approaches. The problem we have of sustainability is a much bigger problem than we realize. You know, we think we have a problem today. About 500 million people on this planet, mostly in the Western world, have an energy-rich lifestyle. We have air conditioning, we have nice cars, things like that. We fly on aeroplanes. In fact, within 30 or 40 years, 5 billion people want that same energy-rich lifestyle. So we can't use less energy, we'll be using a lot more energy. And in fact, if everybody's using the same amount of energy as we do, we'll use 10 times as much to accommodate all the people striving to the same kind of lifestyle we have. So the problem is much worse than we think it is. There's about 2.5 billion people who live on about $2.50 a day. That's about what a Stanford student probably spends in a week. 5 billion people live on about $10 a day. 5 billion of the 6.5 billion people on this planet. The good news is they want economic growth. Good news is they want lots of economic growth. The bad news is the environmentalists generally don't like economic growth. And they don't want these dreams of these 5 billion people to come true. And that's a fundamental conflict because environmentalists are always arguing against growth. In fact, for those of you who are interested, there's a good book written by an environmentalist called Why We Can't Leave Saving the Planet to the Environmentalists. What these guys want, these 5 billion people, is sustenance, not sustainability. And we can't argue with that. It's a compelling argument. The other thing I want to talk about, before I go too deep into the actual business of sustainability, is all the forecasts and pundits you hear about. I love pundits because they extrapolate the past. They take what's happened in the past and assume nothing changes and project the future. So you hear all these scenarios. But in my view, these pundits, these experts, all the people you see appearing on NBC as experts, the professors you talk to or hear from with their econometric models, generally assume a very static world. And the world isn't very static. So, here's what happens. One of the important messages I want to give you today is to not pay attention to these experts. All those forecasts, you hear about what's going to happen. So let me tell you about a funny study that Professor Tetlock at UC Berkeley did. He decided to follow experts. He followed 250 experts across 20 years in about 80,000 separate forecasts. What he discovered after about 20 years of this and fairly rigorous statistical analysis, and all of you should take statistics, that the average accuracy of experts was about the same as dart-throwing monkeys. That was the net conclusion of 20 years of research. And so, when experts tell you what's going to happen, the most important thing to do is ignore it and to invent your own future. You invent your own reality. Inventing a new future, especially with the help of technology, and I'll talk about that a bit more, is the only way we bridge the gap of not being able to afford the consequences, the environmental consequences of the energy use of 500 million people, and stretch it to meeting the needs of 5 billion people and still meeting our environmental needs. In fact, technology, I believe, is the only lever we have. It's not a sufficient lever because we need the right policies, but it is the only large lever to bridge that gap. So let me go on and talk about sustainability first. How am I doing for time? The first thing I learned looking at this, and I've been looking at it for well over a decade now, that the most important principle in sustainability is economic gravity. Just like objects on our planet don't defy the laws of gravity, no effort in sustainability can defy the laws of economic gravity in scale. Which means those 5 billion people who can barely afford much will not buy stuff that's more expensive. And most environmentalists forget that. The second thing I want to say is that the things you hear about, solar and wind, are not sufficient. In fact, they're mostly immaterial. If we had 10 times the amount of solar that we have today, 1,000% growth, if we had 10 times the amount of wind we have, they'd still be largely immaterial. So, we have to talk about the 80% that's the hard part, not the 10 or 20% that's easy. I can easily see solar growing from 0.5% of the world's energy to 5%, but does that matter? And the reason it won't grow more is because it's expensive. Because it doesn't give a rate of return to anybody who invests in it. They don't get their money back fast. And we all know we live in a world where people don't like putting money out now and taking a long time to get paid back. So let me give you some examples of this example of economic gravity. I apply what I call the Chindia test to any technology that shows up, which is, will the average person in India or China buy this technology? Because if they won't, it won't scale. You know, it's easy for those of us living in San Francisco or Germany, or at least the 5 or 10% of us living in San Francisco or Germany who can afford technologies and willing to pay more for our conscience to adapt these technologies. But let's not mistake them for the reality that is most people's reality. They barely have enough and refuse to pay any more just because somebody else can have a more sustainable lifestyle. This is both bad news, it's also good news. In fact, when I looked in the US and looked at the kinds of things that we talk about in sustainability, solar and wind, surprisingly, nobody in Mississippi is buying them. I call that the Mississippi test. Unless technologies get adapted by people who aren't here in sort of green San Francisco or the Green Bay Area or the Northeast of the United States, they're not going to scale. So we have to be very, very conscious of that. I suspect, and I haven't been able to check the facts, but there are more Priuses sold in Berkeley than in Mississippi. And there's something wrong with that picture. So, the basic principle of if it's not economic, it doesn't scale applies. The basic principle of being pragmatic about these, being pragmatalists, not environmentalists, applies. And unfortunately, when I heard a talk by the CEO of Exxon a few years ago, he said the following in front of a Senate hearing. He said, those environmentalists can worry about 5% of our energy that's renewable. I'm going to worry about the remaining 95%. I'm going to worry about the cheapest form of energy I can get. And unfortunately, he's more right than wrong when you apply it to the 5 billion people I talked about on this planet. And that's the technological challenge. We love electric cars, but they don't matter till they are 5 times cheaper in how much more they cost. The good news, in my view, and I'll talk a little more about this, is most of technology can be reinvented. Things you can't imagine can be reinvented. We've recently started to look in some esoteric areas, like can you apply technology to agriculture? Turns out you can in droves. There's so many areas for innovation, even in an odd area. Let me give you a good example. Most people don't realize when we eat our steak that a kilogram of beef on your table takes 15,000 liters of water to produce. 1 kilogram of beef. That's a lot of water. Turns out it takes 7 pounds of corn to produce 1 pound of beef. Animals are pretty inefficient at converting protein, plant protein, into animal protein, which us humans like to eat. But in fact, technology can make that process 5 times more efficient. And there are people starting to work on clever designs for new foods. New ways, new foods, new protein, new nutrition. In fact, what our system of agriculture was built on, which was lots of calories, is no longer a problem on this planet. In fact, we have the reverse problem of too many calories and not enough nutrition. So, we can in fact reinvent agriculture. We can in fact reinvent how we farm and produce stuff. I've been very intrigued with the simple idea, what if plants were tolerant of salt water? Suddenly, a lot more land would be available to produce food. Now that's just a bit of genetic engineering that people are working on. And so that's what I mean by technology being a huge resource multiplier. Having given you all the bad news of how many more people want energy-rich lifestyles and food-rich lifestyles, the good news is that in fact we have all the tools, especially if more of you will do technology and help with this problem. So let me talk about environmentalists for a bit. I've generally found they do a very, very good job of finding problems, defining problems, and in fact, surfacing problems. They do a relatively poor job of defining solutions to problems. So, I find often they get in the way of solutions because they're too idealistic. They're not pragmatalists. They're not pragmatic. I've also found, and lots of people with good consciences want to work on nonprofits, that generally those have problems scaling. And addressing most of these problems can only be done by a capitalistic approach to things. It's very hard to scale without appealing to basic human instincts around greed. Fortunately, I believe the problem can be framed where people can be motivated to solve these problems in their own self-interest, which is the fundamental premise of capitalism, especially if you put enough checks and balances on that capitalism. And I think the key is to achieve that balance. I have another pet peeve with environmentalists. You see, I have a lot of friends who are environmentalists and I get along very well with them. But I find they're seldom realistic. And I find people generally interested in sustainability get more prone to fashion, or susceptible to fashion, I should say. I recently saw an ad for eco bikinis. Now, small bikinis may be nice, but there's nothing eco about them. I saw an ad for sustainable tar sands that Shell actually put out. A real ad. I'd be embarrassed to put that ad out. So at both extremes, you see all these silly fashion statements getting on the bandwagon. Many of you who care about sustainability probably care about things like organic food. Let me give you some statistics. Organic milk requires almost twice the amount of land that ordinary milk does. It releases 20% more greenhouse gases, releases 60% more nutrients into the water. Organic tomatoes require twice the energy that normal tomatoes do. And this is studied by the UK Department of Environment. So, being pragmatic about this is important. I already talked about the amount of water beef takes to produce. So when I hear people talk about taking shorter showers to be environmental, I say just become a vegetarian. That's going to have 2 orders of magnitude more effect than taking a shorter shower. Somebody likes that. Now, some people have other reasons not to take showers, but we won't go into that. People love solar power, people love wind power. They forget that what they love more than solar power and wind power is watching their favorite TV show or NFL game when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. And when you worry about the infrastructure of a society or a city, you have to make sure that you have power all the time. And you can't be impractical about it. I suspect some of you here own a Prius. Now, if Prius is a fashion statement, go for it. It's no different than an expensive pair of jeans. But if you're going to pay $5,000 more for a Prius to be more sustainable and have less carbon emissions, I can tell you that painting your roof white of your home will save just about as much carbon over 10 years as a Prius will. This only costs a few $100s on a Saturday afternoon. So we have to be realistic about what we push and pragmatic and separate the fashion. My favorite is Sheryl Crow, who says, well, we should only use 1 sheet of toilet paper when going to the lift. I'm sorry, if everybody switched from using 2 sheets to 1 sheet, I don't think it'll save the planet or even make a noticeable difference. I have a real beef with sort of these fashion statements. My favorite is a group in Australia that's pushing kangaroo meat instead of cattle beef because it emits 20% to have kangaroo meat. So let me give you another example of what practical action means. Al Gore is a good friend of mine. He's done a great job of defining the problem that we have with greenhouse gases, given it a lot of visibility. He's defined the problem well. But when it comes to solutions, he mostly talks about what people should do, not what people would do, given left to their own devices. I've had many a conversation saying, the people who matter in this debate don't listen to him. Hey, the environmentalists, they pay attention, pack the halls. Ask any Republican if he cares what Al Gore has to say. And what's especially important is the vast majority of people, in the United States at least, are in the middle. They care about the environment, but not enough to do much about it. They're not the ones who say climate change doesn't exist. Reaching them, bridging out to them, not with religious fervor, but with rational arguments and practical outreach and practical conversation, not moralistic statements about what they should do, is what's really, really important. Creating that bridge is more important than creating the edges of either the complete sustainability bigot or the climate change doesn't exist bigot. In fact, those two extremes almost don't matter in the debate. Everybody already knows where they stand. Let me try and finish with a few statements. This is hard stuff. But the good news is, what I've found in my life is the most fun stuff to do is the hard stuff. Easy stuff sort of gets boring after a while. When you're doing really hard challenges, when you're working hard at it, even after 20, 30 years of doing it, you're still motivated. Because you're still challenged. I personally believe challenge always is the most fun part of life. It's the part that leads to most satisfaction. It's the thing I encourage everybody to do. Many ideas that seem outrageous don't seem outrageous after you've worked on them in a while. My favorite is two quotes, one from George Bernard Shaw, who said, "All progress depends on the unreasonable man," and the second one from Martin Luther King, who said, human salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. And in fact, that kind of approach to life solves the hardest of problems, even as hard as the climate problem. What's also important to me is your willingness to try new things, which means your willingness to fail. I always say, my willingness to fail at things gives me the ability to succeed. In fact, it's the only thing that gives me the ability to succeed, because it gives me the ability to take risks and try new things. In fact, I saw a quote from Larry Page recently, who said that the only true failure is not attempting the audacious. Even if you fail in your ambitious thing, he said, it's very hard to fail completely, so you will have achieved something. But I also tell people, only try things it's worth failing at. Because failing doesn't matter, but if you succeed, it better be worth succeeding at. And that's important. So don't just become a banker or a Google or Facebook employee. So, do new things, which is one of the greatest things about the Bay Area. There's so many role models of people trying outrageous things. So, let me tell you what I believe we will achieve in a very short time, like in the next 5 or 10 years. I suspect every bulb you see will take 20% of the electricity to produce the same amount of light. We'll produce 5 times the amount of light with the same amount of electricity. We'll produce 5 times the amount of air conditioning, because things will get 75-80% more efficient. That goes a long way towards bridging that 10x gap between 500 million people and 5 billion people. No question, engines can be 100% more efficient and use half as much oil, and then replace most of that with renewable sources. Those kinds of technical advances are conceivable today. When I think of what's possible over 20 years, I think it's hard to imagine. To imagine 20 years from now, my guess is you'd have to look at today and imagine today in the year 1950 or so, because of the rate of change and the rate of progress. So, in fact, my end message is a very optimistic one. I'm truly an optimist, maybe a technology optimist. But it is, in fact, the single most important thing we can do. If we don't do it, we have a huge problem. It's very doable, so we should do it. It's also fun and rewarding to do it. So let me stop there and maybe take a few questions. Question in the back there?
My understanding is we have a lot of good technologies that can solve our problems, but we lack the political, economic, social, and cultural will to implement them. Can you speak to that?
So the question, I'll repeat the question, that we have a lot of the technologies, but we don't have the political and cultural will to implement them. I actually don't believe that's true. We do have a lot of technologies. Most of them are not economic yet. When a technology becomes economic, gets widely adopted. And frankly, nobody was working on energy technologies till as recently as 3-4 years ago. And so they are relatively new, immature. They will get economic. And as much as I argue against uneconomic technologies, there is a case to be made that those of us, the 5% of San Franciscans I talked about, who are early adapters, will let technologies get down the cost curve and motivate those technologists and entrepreneurs to invent yet better technologies. So there is a motivation factor. But I don't believe replacement EVs are not economic today. LED lights are not economic today. Solar panels are not economic today. If you look at what people use as metrics of economics today.
Can I just follow up on that?
Sure.
I think part of the economics is the very heavy subsidization of the current ways things are done. I think perhaps without the military dollars, without the road infrastructure paid for by all of us, gasoline would be more expensive, road transportation would be more expensive, these other things would make more sense.
Yeah, so let me repeat the question, a follow-up question, which was many things have large subsidies that exist today. And in fact, that's true. So when I say be pragmatic, I mean the following. We have to compete despite those built-in subsidies. Some of them are subsidies, some of those are fully amortized technologies that got other benefits. The government built the roads so automobiles can travel more cheaply. That's an example of an indirect subsidy. But if you build public transportation today, it becomes too expensive. But by and large, a pragmatic approach is incumbents, whether they're Exxon or General Motors, will take advantage of the position they're in, and we have to acknowledge that and still beat them on cost and performance.
Yes. What can an economist do to push forward to bring about economic efficiency?
What can an economist do to bring about efficiency? Get a job in technology.
There are fancy incentives that you can use.
Yeah. No, I'm just kidding. Look, there are clever economic models to be adopted. Let me give you an example. The question of oil subsidies was brought up. Nowhere when computing subsidies for oil do we compute the fact that since 1976 we have spent $7 trillion just on the Navy fleet that patrols the oil lanes in the Gulf. $7 trillion. To me, that's a subsidy in delivering oil safely. And so the gentleman is right. And economists can do those calculations. I've not seen really good calculations from economists on these kinds of models. There are other things one can do. Come up with better economic models that both meet good economic principles but also meet pragmatic principles. Take the example of cap and trade. All right? To me, cap and trade is a pretty unfair system. And that's why it's not been adapted. So let me give you an economic argument of why cap and trade is bad. Cap and trade says we in the Western world had very high growth, used lots of oil and coal to get that growth. We're in a pretty good place with $40,000 per person GDP per capita income. And those of you who are at $3,000 per capita income have to use all renewable technologies and very expensive technologies to achieve that growth. Now that's a bad economic argument. A good economic argument is if you invest in energy-saving technologies, your economy will be more energy efficient, hence it will be more competitive globally. So instead of doing cap and trade in absolute carbon emissions, let's measure carbon emissions per dollar of GDP. I won't go into the details, but there's lots of clever structures that can be achieved even to contribute to the debate in a healthy way. Yes?
So in terms of the federal policy, as cap and trade's dead, and so a group got together last summer of business titans, including Bill Gates and John Doerr and Chad Holliday, and they came out and they said, what we need to focus on is making clean energy cheap, driving innovation like you're talking about, and that's going to require increasing federal investment in energy research and development by at least $10 billion up to around the scale of $15 to $16 billion annually. Is that an agenda you would support in terms of federal policy going forward?
Yeah, that's so the question is, would I support an agenda that some people have put together a group to talk about much larger investments in clean energy? It's an agenda I absolutely support. But the pragmatic side of me says in this budget-cutting environment, it's not going to happen. That's what I mean by being a pragmatalist instead of an environmentalist. So I take the following alternative approach. I always support it. I sign those letters. I always speak about it. Whenever I talk to any politician, I encourage them to do this, but I don't count on it. What do? I invest in technology. I invest in technology in a different kind of way. Now, if you're just an investor, you invest in the next improvement in solar cells. So you take a little bit of risk and get a better technology. That's one kind of investment. I've personally chosen to do a different kind of technology investment. This is where that principle I talked about, where, hey, you don't mind failing, but if you succeed, it should be something that's worth succeeding at. So let me give you an example. Could I design a better engine that has 10% more mileage for your car? Absolutely. It'd be a low-risk technology investment. And I'd probably succeed at it a little sooner, a little later. That depends on how good the people are. But 10% doesn't matter. Now, 50 or 75% or 100% matters. Now, if I invest in a technology, an engine technology like that, I'm 90% likely to fail because it's much harder technical problems. But that's what I want to invest in, because if it succeeds, even if there's only a 10% chance, it matters. I talked about the fact that LED light bulbs aren't expensive. You can go buy an LED light bulb. It's $75. Now, how many people are going to replace every bulb in their house with a $75 light bulb? So what we did is threw away all the LED technology and said, we'll invent a new technology, starting with a new substrate, a new material to build those LEDs on. Now, people said, lots of problems, you're going to fail. I said, fine. It's okay to fail. But if we succeed, that light bulb will save more electricity in the very first year than it costs to buy. And then everybody will buy it. And that's the kind of technology bet I want to make, and I think more people should make. I call those black swan technologies. Technologies that make economic sense no matter what policy does, what regulation does, whether we have carbon caps or not. And it can be done. Other questions? Yes, and then I'll go over there.
So do you see VCs in the clean tech space shifting to this almost social manufacturer sort of model?
So the question is, do I see venture capitalists shifting to this model? No. Most people do sensible investing and they don't like to lose their money. As a good economist will tell you, if most people are doing sensible things, there's plenty of space left for risk takers, and there's pretty good economics for risk takers if you have a little bit of guts. And in fact, I consider the area we are investing in unique because there's very little competition, and whenever you have less competition, an economist will tell you you have good returns. So I like that space. There's a question in the back there.
Yeah, what do you see as the role of people who are not, like English majors, for example, or artists who are not going to be working necessarily in technological fields?
So what do I see as the role of English majors, for example? I was told not to talk about English majors. Look, a contribution that can be made is being an early adapter, because it gets people started, gets more interest going. There are a lot of things you can do, even as an English major. No, look. Look, communicating, let me be serious about this. Communicating about these technologies is an important part. Messaging is very important. And in fact, let me talk about sort of a non-technical thing that's very important. Most human beings are pattern recognizers. They're not rational beings. I'll tell you I won't tell you my favorite story on this. It's about Yale students. So, but technical people are very bad at communicating with people who are not rational. Engineers like engineering arguments, rational arguments. In fact, most people don't understand rational arguments. They behave emotionally. And people on the art side, on the English side, in the literature side, are better at empathy, which is a big part of communication. And I think communicating those messages are important. And in fact, technology is an absolute enabler. You absolutely need those breakthroughs. Without that, you have nothing. But once you have that, it still needs to be disseminated. Message, disseminated, delivered, and there's a lot to be done. Yes?
Do you see there being any sort of big disruptive changes in the solar industry, or do you think it's going to continue as it currently is with just slow cost cutting and improvement in processes?
So I think most efforts on the solar industry are incremental and mostly uninteresting. There are a few radical efforts, and if one of them succeeds, in fact I'd like to say when one of them succeeds, because there are always people in the fringe who do the most interesting things. Remember what Martin Luther King said, the creatively maladjusted. Even in technology, there's the creatively maladjusted on the extreme edges. And they cause most of the changes. And they will keep attempting things more radical. They may have a 90% chance of failure, but when they succeed, because enough people will attempt it, we'll see disruptive changes. So we'll see a step behavior. Yes?
So you're saying that it's disruptive technologies versus incremental that are going to save us. But what makes you so optimistic about our ability to discover those technologies? So this is disruptive, it's kind of really hard to predict, and so where does your optimism come from?
So the question is, why am I optimistic about these disruptive technologies? What I like to say, if you're a hockey fan, how do you score more goals, more shots on goal? That's what you do. You take lots and lots of shots, and then hope the puck sneaks in once in a while. I like to say that improbable is not unimportant. And when I look at the choice between lots of improbable shots on goal and a few incremental shots, the sensible investing paradigm, I'm almost certain that some improbable, the most improbables will fail. The only likelihood of success is some improbable. I like to say, if it took 10,000 technology efforts, and we had 10,000 dot-com startups here in the last 15 years, you only need a Google and a Facebook to completely change the landscape. We'll take 10,000 shots at technologies and 10 will succeed, and I have very little doubt that 20 years from now, no assumption about our energy infrastructure or our social infrastructure will be true. Almost all of it will be disrupted. Because the improbable is not unimportant. In fact, the most likely winner is some improbable. You just don't know which one. Yes?
So by 2048, our fisheries are going to collapse. And so technology is an area that actually improves or actually hurts fisheries more than helps. Now, there have been special management practices by economists that have been put into place. Now, what would you say about something where technology isn't like the traditional economic drive that you usually see in other sustainable initiatives?
So let me try and repeat the question. I didn't follow all of it. The question is, technology, our fisheries, for example, are going to collapse. Technology helps that. The important thing to remember about technology is a tool. Technology doesn't have intent. Human beings have intent, and you can use any tool for good or bad. I can definitely radar scan fish schools and deplete them faster. I can definitely turn nuclear energy into a nuclear bomb. So I can use technology with bad intent, but you can also use technology with good intent. I was talking about organic farming. The same is true of local foods. Local foods are ecologically much less sound. And in fact, there's a book called Just Food that talks about the fact that, in fact, farmed fish may actually be better than natural fish. Just get the book and read it. That we can, in fact, do these things well. This is where communication and English majors actually do become important, because we appeal to psychology. We need to communicate the right messages and develop the right intent. Thank you all very much. Thank you.